The airport was louder than usual that evening, filled with restless voices, rolling suitcases, and the sharp echo of announcements bouncing off the high ceiling. People were tired. Some were annoyed. Others were simply trying to get through the day. Delays had piled up, and the mood in the terminal felt heavy, like something was waiting to happen. Near one of the crowded boarding gates sat a man with his young child curled up beside him. He didn't look like someone who traveled often. His clothes were clean but worn, his shoes slightly scuffed, and there were faint dark circles under his eyes that spoke of long nights and very little rest. One hand rested protectively on his child's shoulder, as if even in the middle of all this noise, he wanted to make sure nothing disturbed that small moment of peace. He checked the time again, not because it had changed much, but because waiting felt easier when he had something to focus on. His phone battery was almost dead, and he had already stopped himself from checking it too often. He needed it for later. The child shifted slightly, blinking awake, confused for a second before recognizing where they were. The man smiled gently. "Still a bit more waiting," he said softly. The child nodded, still sleepy, then leaned against him again without saying anything more. Trust came easily at that age. The kind of trust that believed everything would be okay just because a parent was there. He adjusted the small bag at his feet, making sure it was zipped properly. Inside were just the basics. A few clothes, some snacks, a folded document he had checked at least 10 times already. This trip wasn't a vacation. It wasn't something fun or planned long in advance. It was important. The kind of important that made a person nervous, even when they tried not to show it. Across from him, near the boarding desk, stood a man in uniform. His posture was straight, almost instinctively so, but there was a quiet exhaustion in the way he held himself. Not the kind that came from a long day at work, but something deeper, something that didn't go away after a good night's sleep. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. No loud conversations, no phone calls, no complaints. Just standing there, waiting his turn like everyone else. But a few people noticed him. Some glanced quickly, recognizing the uniform. Others looked a little longer, perhaps out of respect, perhaps curiosity. But no one approached him. The single father noticed too. He didn't stare, just observed for a moment. There was something about the way the soldier stood, calm, quiet, and patient, that made it hard to ignore. It reminded him of people who carried more than what others could see. An announcement broke through the noise. "Attention passengers for Flight 247. We will begin boarding shortly." A wave of movement spread across the gate area. People sat up straighter, grabbed their bags, checked their boarding passes again. The tension shifted into urgency. The father gently nudged his child awake again. "Hey, time to get ready." The child rubbed their eyes and nodded, holding onto his arm as they both stood up. Lines began to form. First-class passengers were called first, then priority boarding, then groups one by one. The soldier stepped forward when his group was called. He walked with quiet confidence, not rushing, not hesitating. At the counter, something changed. The airline staff member scanned his boarding pass, then paused. Her expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. "Just a moment," she said, typing something into her system. The soldier waited patiently. Another staff member leaned over. They whispered briefly. More typing followed. The first staff member's polite smile returned, but it didn't quite reach her eyes this time. "I'm sorry," she said. "There seems to be an issue with your seat." The soldier frowned slightly, not in anger, just confusion. "Issue?" "Yes. It looks like your upgrade didn't go through properly. You've been reassigned." He glanced at his boarding pass, then back at her. "I confirmed this earlier." "I understand," she replied, her tone now more rehearsed and empathetic. "But the system has updated. Your new seat is an economy." A few people nearby began to listen more closely. The soldier didn't raise his voice. "There must be some mistake." "We've checked already," she said, a bit quicker this time. "There's nothing we can do." There was a brief silence, the kind that feels longer than it is. The father, still in line with his child, watched the exchange carefully. He noticed the small details others might miss. The way the soldier's shoulders tightened just slightly. The way he took a slow breath before responding. "I had a long trip, the soldier said quietly. I just need the seat I was assigned. I'm sorry, she repeated, though now it sounded more like a closing statement than an apology. You can either accept the new seat or wait for the next flight. That last part caught people's attention. A few passengers exchanged looks. Some shook their heads slightly, but said nothing. The soldier stood still for a moment. Then he nodded. Fine, he said simply. No argument. No scene. Just acceptance. He stepped aside, holding his boarding pass, and waited. The father felt something shift inside him. He looked down at his child, who was watching too, wide-eyed and curious. What happened? The child whispered. The father hesitated for a second, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people don't get treated the way they should. The child frowned, not fully understanding, but sensing it wasn't right. The line moved forward. Passengers continued boarding as if nothing had happened. Conversations resumed. Phones came out again. The moment faded for most people, but not for him. When it was finally his turn, he stepped up to the counter, handing over his boarding pass. The staff member scanned it quickly, her professional smile back in place. Everything looks good, she said. He nodded, but didn't move. Instead, he glanced back at the soldier, still standing quietly off the side. Then, he looked at the staff member again. Can I ask something? He said. She paused. Yes. He took a breath, not out of nervousness, but to steady his thoughts. Why was his seat taken away? The question caught her off guard. That's not something I can discuss, she replied. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly. Then he looked back at the soldier one more time. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Not the mistake itself. Those happen. But the way it was handled, the way it was dismissed. His child tugged lightly at his hand. Are we going? They asked. He looked down, then back up again. And in that moment, something changed. A quiet decision. The kind that doesn't need time, just heart. He turned back toward the counter, his expression calm, but different now. Actually, he said, I need to change something. The staff member blinked. Change. He nodded. Behind him, the line began to grow impatient. People shifted, checking their watches, sighing softly. But he didn't move. Not this time. Because for the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about the delay or the long journey ahead or how tired he felt. He was thinking about something else entirely. And whatever he was about to do, it was going to matter more than anyone there realized. Even him. The father stood quietly at the counter, his child clinging lightly to his side, and took a deep breath. The noise of the terminal seemed to fade around him. He wasn't thinking about the boarding line, the tired passengers, or the delays. His mind was focused on the soldier, standing patiently, holding on to dignity as the airline staff ignored the injustice. He said calmly, I want to give him my seat. The words hung in the air. The staff member blinked. Her expression caught somewhere between surprise and disbelief. Your seat? She asked carefully, as though he had just spoken another language. Yes, he replied without hesitation. He deserves it more than I do. There was a pause. Behind the counter, the staff whispered quickly to one another, their heads turning toward computers, phones, and each other. The terminal seemed to quiet even more around them. Some passengers glanced over, curious now, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The child tugged gently at his father's sleeve. Dad, what are you doing? He bent down and whispered softly, helping someone, doing the right thing, even when it's hard. The child nodded, eyes wide. There was a sense of awe in that quiet gesture of understanding. Even without fully grasping the situation, the child knew it mattered. The staff member spoke again, her voice firmer this time. Sir, you can't just give your seat away. It's against policy. Boarding passes are non-transferable. The father shook his head. I understand that, but I don't care about rules right now. I care about what's right. The words were simple, but they carried weight. There was no anger, no frustration, only calm conviction. He turned slightly to look at the soldier, who was watching silently. The soldier's eyes widened just a fraction. He opened his mouth, but then closed it again. He looked uncertain, almost hesitant, as though he couldn't accept such a gesture. "I can't take it," the soldier said softly. It's not right. I can't accept this." The father smiled gently. "It's okay. It's okay to accept kindness, especially when it comes without strings." The child looked up at the soldier and asked, "Are you a hero?" The soldier's eyes flicked to the child, a small, surprised smile breaking his otherwise composed face. He shook his head slightly. "I'm just doing my job." The father crouched slightly to the child's level. "Some heroes don't wear capes," he said softly. "Sometimes they wear uniforms and carry burdens quietly." The staff member cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, I really can't allow this. Please take your assigned seat." The father's calm resolve did not waver. "I won't. I'm offering this seat to him. He deserves it more." The soldier shook his head again, hesitant. "I can't. You've already paid. You need it." The father placed a reassuring hand on the soldier's shoulder. "I don't need it. I can wait in economy. It's fine. You need a break. You've earned this." The soldier hesitated, looking down at the floor, then back at the man and child. Something shifted in his eyes. Perhaps it was the honesty, the genuine compassion. Perhaps it was a quiet strength in the father's stance. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, almost in a whisper. The father gave a small nod. "Don't mention it. Just sit. Relax. You've earned it." Passengers nearby had begun to notice. Whispers traveled along the line. Some pulled out phones, capturing the moment quietly. Others simply watched, unable to tear their eyes away. Something human was happening here. Something rare in a place usually filled with stress and impatience. The staff member finally relented, shaking her head slightly but scanning the boarding passes again. "Fine," she said, seat reassignment complete. The father smiled faintly, glancing down at his child. "See? Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need approval." The child smiled back. "He looks happy now," the child said. "Yes," the father said softly. "And sometimes that's enough." The soldier gathered his belongings and walked toward the first-class cabin, a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his expression. Every step seemed heavier than usual, as if he carried not only his own exhaustion, but now also the weight of someone else's generosity. As the soldier passed through the gate to his seat, the father watched, feeling a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about integrity, about acting with empathy even when no one else might notice. He looked down at his child, who was still clutching his hand. "Remember this moment," he said quietly. "Remember that kindness matters more than comfort, and courage can be quiet." The child nodded, eyes wide with understanding, feeling the weight of a lesson learned without words. The father turned back to the staff member. "Thank you for making this happen," he said, his voice calm but firm. The staff member didn't respond immediately. She seemed unsure, perhaps moved by the act, perhaps frustrated by the disruption. Either way, she scanned his boarding pass and motioned for him to proceed. He smiled faintly, adjusted the child's bag, and they moved toward their seats. The father had prepared himself to sit back, to wait through the flight as he always did. But now, a small shift had occurred, not just in the soldier situation, but in the father himself. He felt lighter somehow. The weight of fatigue and stress still lingered, but it was tempered by the quiet satisfaction of having done something meaningful, something human. Around them, passengers continued boarding, some unaware of what had just happened. Others stole glances, still sensing that this wasn't just another flight. There was a story unfolding that no announcement would capture, a story of quiet heroism and unexpected generosity. The child yawned softly, leaning against the father. "Can we sit now?" "Yes," he said, smiling down. "We can sit. But don't forget, the right thing isn't always easy, and sometimes it takes courage to do it." The child nodded, almost asleep now. "I won't forget," the child whispered. The father reached down, gently brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Good. That's all I ask." For the next few moments, they moved quietly toward their seats, the father carrying the child's small bag, making sure nothing else was needed. He noticed the soldier seated now, relaxed, finally at ease, his posture softening. A small smile appeared on the soldier's face, brief but genuine. The father returned to his own seat in economy, arranging his belongings, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Around him, the sound of the terminal faded as the boarding process continued. Passengers finding their places, some arguing quietly with staff, some chatting, some simply waiting. But in that small space, in that shared human moment, something had shifted. Something quiet, invisible to most, but profound nonetheless. The father glanced once more toward the first-class cabin. The soldier caught his eye briefly, and they shared a nod, silent, unspoken, but full of understanding. Gratitude and respect flowed between them without a word. He turned back to the child. "Ready for flight?" he asked. "Yes," the child replied, still clinging slightly to his father's arm. The father smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. This small act of kindness, this quiet courage, had already made the evening feel lighter. Even in a crowded, noisy airport filled with delays, exhaustion, and stress, a single simple decision had changed the mood of one small corner of the world. And for the father and child, it was a lesson they would carry with them long after flight had landed. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't make headlines. Sometimes, it doesn't even earn recognition. But in moments like this, it is enough to see the quiet relief and gratitude in another person's eyes. And that, the father knew, was worth more than any first-class seat. And so, they settled into the flight, the father holding the child's hand, both of them quietly watching as life continued around them, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that small act of kindness could truly make a difference. In that moment, the father understood something simple, yet profound. Even when life is hard, even when circumstances are difficult, the choice to act with compassion is always within reach. And sometimes, that choice changes everything. The plane had just reached cruising altitude, and the engines hummed steadily. Passengers began settling into their seats. Some were asleep, some were scrolling on phones or tablets. Others whispered quietly to their neighbors. The cabin was calm, the usual quiet lull of flight, carrying hundreds of stories at once. The father leaned back in his seat, glancing down at the child next to him, who was now playing quietly with a small toy from a backpack. For a moment, everything seemed normal. He thought about the soldier, wondering if he was finally able to rest, finally able to feel a small sense of comfort after the long day. But the calm did not last. A flight attendant approached the first-class cabin, speaking quietly into a headset. Then another appeared, checking a clipboard. Murmurs started to pass between them, low and urgent, though nothing was said aloud to the passengers. The father noticed the change immediately. He glanced over his shoulder, curious. Something had shifted. The quiet professionalism of the crew seemed tense now, almost anxious. Minutes passed. Then one of the attendants walked quickly down the aisle toward the cockpit, clutching a small device tightly. The father's brow furrowed slightly. He had no way of knowing exactly what was happening, but he could feel it. Something significant was underway. The soldier, sitting in first class now, adjusted his seat slightly, noticing the small flurry of movement behind him. He did not look alarmed. His posture remained calm, disciplined, but his eyes tracked every subtle shift, every small gesture of the crew. There was a quiet intensity about him, as if he were aware that the situation was not ordinary. The father looked back at him, wondering what had brought this level of attention. He had only wanted to help, only wanted to do the right thing. And yet, here it was, something bigger than either of them was unfolding. Another attendant whispered into a headset. A senior crew member approached, scanning the seating chart. Their fingers hovered over the tablet as they exchanged hurried, serious looks. The father noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. The calm of the flight was replaced with a subtle tension. People around them were still mostly unaware, but a few passengers glanced around, sensing that something was off. Some even peeked toward first class, curious. The father returned his attention to his child, who had noticed a small change too. "What's happening?" the child whispered, voice tinged with concern. "I don't know yet," the father replied softly. "But don't worry. Everything will be fine." Even as he said it, his mind raced. He hadn't imagined that a simple act of kindness could draw attention in this way. He had only offered his seat, to someone who needed it. He had never thought it would lead to anything beyond a small moment of relief for the soldier. Then a subtle ripple moved through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small situation to address. Please remain seated and calm. We will have more information shortly." Passengers murmured quietly. Some glanced toward the front of the plane, curious. Others looked back toward first class, sensing something unusual. The father's gaze remained steady on the soldier. The soldier's hands were folded neatly in his lap, eyes calm but alert. There was no panic, no sign of fear, just a quiet confidence, as if he knew exactly what was happening and trusted that it would be resolved. The child tugged at his father's sleeve. "Is he in trouble?" "No," the father said, keeping his voice calm. "Not trouble. Just something important is happening." The crew continued their quiet flurry of activity. More whispers, more hurried checks. The father noticed a small device being handed from one attendant to another, the same device that had traveled toward the cockpit. Then a realization struck him. This was not just about a seat. It wasn't about a boarding mistake or a minor inconvenience. The attention, the urgency, it meant that the soldier was significant in a way he hadn't realized. The father's heart beat a little faster, but he kept his composure. He looked at the child, who was now clutching his arm slightly tighter. "Remember," he whispered, "sometimes we help people without knowing the full story. That doesn't make what we did any less right." The child nodded, wide-eyed, gripping his father's hand. The plane continued to fly smoothly, but the tension in first class grew. The soldier adjusted slightly, eyes scanning subtly, still calm but alert. The crew spoke in hushed tones, gestures brief but precise. Every movement suggested caution, concern, and an awareness that something serious had developed. The father shifted slightly in his seat, thinking about what had happened at the gate. He had acted without expectation. He had simply given someone his seat. And yet, now that simple action had brought a ripple of activity and attention that he had never imagined. The child leaned against him. "Dad, why are they acting like that?" He smiled softly, stroking the child's hair gently. "Sometimes people in uniforms carry things we can't see, responsibilities that are bigger than us. And sometimes, helping them matters more than we know." As the flight continued, the situation in first class became more apparent. Another senior crew member came forward, speaking quietly into a headset. The captain's voice followed on the intercom, calm but deliberate. "Please remain seated. The situation involves security protocol. We will provide updates as soon as possible." Passengers exchanged whispers. Some looked around nervously. Others tried to continue reading, scrolling on phones, or pretending not to notice. But the father and child remained focused, their attention subtly drawn to the calm figure in first class. He realized then that the soldier was not ordinary. There was a quiet strength, a disciplined composure, and an awareness of situation that went beyond any passenger he had ever seen. He carried himself like someone who had faced challenges before, someone who had responsibility in ways the father could only guess. The child tilted their head. "Dad," he looks calm. "Is he okay?" "Yes," the father said softly. "He's fine." Calmness sometimes means strength, and sometimes strength is quiet. The crew continued their subtle flurry of activity, moving quickly but efficiently. They spoke to each other in soft tones, checked equipment, and made brief gestures toward the cockpit. The father noticed the care in their movements, the professionalism, but also the unmistakable tension that suggested urgency and concern. He thought back to the moment at the gate. He had acted instinctively, guided by what felt right. And now, without realizing it, he had become part of something larger, something he didn't fully understand. The soldier adjusted his seat slightly and looked around calmly. His eyes briefly met the father's, and they exchanged a small, almost imperceptible nod. Gratitude and recognition passed silently between them, unspoken but deeply felt. The father looked down at his child. "See," he whispered, "sometimes helping someone quietly changes more than we ever imagine. Even if we don't understand it right away, it matters." The child nodded, gripping his father's hand tighter, eyes wide with understanding. Minutes passed. The plane hummed steadily, passengers adjusting to flight. But in that small corner of the cabin, tension and curiosity had created a quiet awareness. Something unusual was happening. Something that would ripple far beyond the moment of boarding. The father leaned back slightly, feeling a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. He had acted with kindness, with courage, without thinking of consequences. And now, the consequences were arriving. Not as punishment, but as recognition that sometimes even small actions intersect with larger realities in ways we cannot predict. The child yawned softly, leaning against him. "Do you think he's happy?" "Yes," the father said, smiling faintly. "I think he's happy and safe, and that's what matters right now." The father's gaze returned briefly to the soldier, sitting quietly in first class, calm but alert. The subtle tension among the crew, the whispered conversations, and the small flurry of activity all pointed to one truth. The man he had helped was more than just another traveler. And the father realized that sometimes the quietest decisions, the smallest gestures of kindness, could have the most unexpected impact. He looked down at the child, still clutching his hand, and whispered, "Remember this. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just help one person. Sometimes it sets things in motion that we can't even see." The child nodded, still wide-eyed, sensing the weight of the moment. The father took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief moment of calm. Outside, the clouds drifted past the windows. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. Life on the plane went on, as it always did. But inside that small corner of the world, a story was unfolding, quiet, human, and profoundly significant. The father knew, without a doubt, that the act he had taken at the gate would resonate far beyond what he could imagine. And though he didn't fully understand the soldier's significance, he knew this. Sometimes courage and kindness are all it takes to change the course of a day, or even a life. And in that moment, as the plane flew steadily through the sky, the father and child sat quietly, hearts open, witnessing something rare and extraordinary in the most ordinary of places. The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the night sky, but a quiet tension had settled in the cabin. The father and his child remained in their seats, the father's hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. Even though the engines roared softly beneath them, the air felt heavy, as if everyone on board knew something was happening that they couldn't fully see. The first-class cabin had become a hub of subtle activity. Flight attendants whispered urgently, scanning passenger lists repeatedly, their expressions tight. A senior crew member walked the aisle twice, checking devices, making quiet phone calls into headsets, and gesturing toward the cockpit. Their movements were precise, professional, but the tension was palpable. The father noticed all of it. He had never traveled often, but he had seen enough to know when something serious was going on. Something had shifted. The calm routine of the flight was gone. He glanced at his child, who was now watching quietly, sensing the change but not fully understanding it. "Stay calm," the father whispered, squeezing the child's hand gently. "Everything is going to be fine. Just stay calm." The child nodded. There was a small tremble in their lips, but they trusted their father. They always did. The soldier remained seated in first class, adjusting his posture slightly, his eyes scanning subtly. He appeared calm, composed, but there was a quiet alertness about him. Not panic, but awareness. Every subtle glance, every measured breath suggested someone trained, someone who had faced pressure before. The father realized then what was happening. The soldier's presence was no ordinary circumstance. The crew's attention, the whispered urgency, the repeated checks, they were responding to the significance of the man in the uniform, not just a boarding mishap. Passengers nearby noticed too. Some whisper among themselves, casting curious glances toward first class. Others try to focus on their screens or books, pretending not to notice, but their curiosity was evident. The father leaned back in his seat, feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease. He had acted without thinking about consequences, offering his seat purely out of kindness. Now, that kindness seemed to have intersected with something much larger than he could have imagined. The flight attendant returned to first class once more, speaking into a headset as she moved quickly but quietly. Another crew member followed, scanning devices and checking paperwork. It was as if the cabin had become a quiet command center, all eyes focused on a single passenger. The father's mind raced. What had he done? He had only offered a seat. And yet, the crew's tension suggested that something was unfolding that could affect more than just his flight. He glanced at his child. "See? Sometimes helping someone quietly changes more than we realize," he said softly. "Even small acts can set things in motion." The child nodded, still clutching his father's hand. "I hope he's okay," the child whispered. "He is," the father replied, his voice calm. "And because of what we did, he's safer and more comfortable than he would have been." As the flight continued, more subtle signals of urgency appeared. The crew moved efficiently but with purpose, checking devices, scanning lists, and whispering into headsets. The father noticed their movements, the way their eyes darted between passengers and devices, the way they carried themselves with both professionalism and tension. The soldier remained calm, folding his hands neatly in his lap, watching everything with a quiet focus. Occasionally, his eyes met the father's briefly, and they exchanged a small, unspoken acknowledgement. Gratitude, respect, and understanding passed silently between them. The father reflected on what had happened at the gate. He had acted without hesitation, offering his seat simply because it felt right. Now, that act had created a ripple he could not have imagined. The child tilted their head, looking toward first class again. "Why are they acting like that?" The father smiled faintly, stroking the child's hair. "Sometimes people carry responsibilities we can't see. And sometimes, helping them quietly makes a bigger difference than we know." Whispers traveled along the aisles as more crew members joined the first-class section, speaking softly into headsets, gesturing, and checking devices. The calm of the flight had transformed into a quiet chaos, hidden from most passengers, but very real for those who knew where to look. The father realized the magnitude of what was happening. The soldier he had helped was more than just a passenger. He was someone with significance, someone whose comfort and safety mattered in ways the father could only guess. The child's hand tightened around his. "Dad, are we in trouble?" "No," the father said softly. "Not at all. We're part of something important, but in a good way. We just need to stay calm." The plane continued on its path, steady but filled with subtle tension. The soldier's presence, the crew's whispered urgency, and the quiet acknowledgement between the father and the soldier created a unique moment. A mix of human kindness and unseen responsibility that few passengers could comprehend. Minutes passed. The crew's flurry of activity continued. They spoke quietly, checking equipment, making brief gestures to one another, and scanning the cabin with careful attention. Their focus was intense, precise, but controlled. The father realized that the kindness he had shown had altered more than the soldier's comfort. It had changed the energy of the cabin, shifting attention and awareness, creating a ripple that affected everyone around him in subtle, unseen ways. He looked at his child, who was now leaning quietly against him, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Remember this," he whispered. "Doing the right thing quietly can have consequences we can't see. Sometimes those consequences are bigger than we expect." The child nodded, eyes wide with understanding. The flight attendants moved with urgency, yet they maintained their professionalism. The cabin hummed with quiet tension, invisible to most, but unmistakable for anyone paying close attention. The soldier remained calm, aware and composed, his presence commanding a quiet respect without words. The father realized something important. He had acted purely from compassion, without expecting anything in return. And yet, that act had not gone unnoticed. It had intersected with something larger than him, something that demanded attention, precision, and respect. The child whispered softly, "Do you think he knows we helped him?" The father smiled faintly. "I think he does, and I think he appreciates it." Sometimes appreciation doesn't need words. It can be quiet, just like the act itself. The plane continued its steady flight, but the quiet chaos in first class was a constant reminder that even small acts of kindness can create waves in ways we cannot predict. The father leaned back slightly, feeling a sense of anticipation mixed with strange calm. He had done what felt right, without thinking of the outcome. And now, the outcome was unfolding, larger than he could have imagined, yet still guided by the simple act of giving his seat to someone who needed it more. He glanced at the soldier once more. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Unspoken, profound, human. The child's hand remained in his, a small anchor amidst the quiet tension. "Dad, can we help people like that too?" "Yes," the father said softly. "Whenever we can. Even small gestures matter. And sometimes they matter more than we ever realize." The plane continued, carrying hundreds of lives, stories, and journeys. But in that small corner, a quiet drama of kindness, courage, and responsibility was unfolding. The father had acted with empathy, and the consequences of that act were beginning to ripple outward, subtle but powerful, changing the course of events in ways he could not yet see. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition, not from reward, but from the knowledge that he had done the right thing, even when no one else was watching, and even when the outcome was uncertain. The child rested against him, finally relaxing, sensing the weight of the moment, but comforted by the father's calm. The father watched the soldier, still calm and composed, and felt a deep sense of connection, a connection born from a simple choice, a small act of generosity, and the courage to do what felt right. And as the plane hummed to the night sky, the father understood something profound. Kindness, courage, and compassion have consequences far beyond the moment. Sometimes, the quietest acts create the largest waves. And this was one of those moments. The plane began its descent, engines humming steadily as it glided through the night sky. The passengers adjusted their seats, fastened seatbelts, and prepared for landing, unaware that the quiet drama in the cabin was far from over. The father held his child's hand, feeling the small squeeze that said more than words ever could: reassurance, curiosity, and trust. First-class cabin was tense, though controlled. The soldier sat upright, composed as ever, yet the subtle shifts of crew around him revealed the ongoing urgency. Devices were checked one last time, whispered conversations exchanged, and a senior attendant spoke quietly into a headset, glancing repeatedly at the soldier. The father leaned toward his child. "Remember how we helped him?" he whispered. "Sometimes doing the right thing quietly changes more than we can imagine." The child nodded, eyes wide. "Do you think they'll notice?" "They already have," the father replied softly. "And sometimes noticing doesn't mean saying anything right away." As the plane touched down smoothly, the cabin lights brightened slightly, signaling the approach to the gate. The moment of stillness before the landing fell heavy, almost as if everyone on board sensed the gravity of what had happened. On the tarmac, airline personnel were already waiting. Their expressions were professional, but a subtle tension lingered in their stance. Phones rang quietly. Conversations were hushed, and the sense of urgency was clear. The father and child remained in their seats, observing. They could feel that something important was about to happen, though they did not fully understand the scope. The soldier stood from his seat as soon as the plane slowed to a taxi, moving with calm precision. He paused for a moment to glance at the father. A quiet nod passed between them, unspoken, full of acknowledgement and gratitude. Passengers began to disembark. Most were unaware of the subtle chaos that had followed their flight, focused on luggage, phones, or the next step in their day. But the father and child stayed a few steps behind, observing. As they reached the front of the cabin, a small group of airline officials and airport security approached. The father could see the seriousness in their eyes, the careful attention in their movements. They weren't angry. They were precise, methodical, and clearly aware of the soldier's importance. The father's heart beat a little faster. He had only acted out of kindness, never imagining that it would lead to this. Yet here it was. His simple gesture had drawn attention in ways he could not have foreseen. The soldier spoke quietly to one of the officials, his voice calm, controlled, and deliberate. The father could not hear the words, but the manner in which the official nodded and glanced toward the father told him everything he needed to know. He had been noticed. One of the officials turned to the father, expression neutral but attentive. "Sir," he said, "thank you for your cooperation and consideration. Your actions have not gone unnoticed." The father blinked, unsure how to respond. I was just trying to help," he said softly. The official nodded. Sometimes, helping quietly is the most important action of all. The soldier stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on the father's shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know how to explain it, but what you did, it mattered more than you know." The father's chest tightened. He had not expected recognition. He had not sought it. Yet here it was, offered sincerely, without fanfare, without expectation. The child, still holding his father's hand, looked up at the soldier. "You're welcome?" the child asked quietly. The soldier smiled gently at the child. "Thank you, too," he said, voice warm and steady. Even small gestures count. The officials nodded to the soldier, giving him space to continue. The father felt the weight of the moment, the realization that his small act of kindness had touched someone deeply, someone carrying responsibility far beyond what he could imagine. The child tugged gently at the father's sleeve. "Dad, did we really help him?" "Yes," the father whispered, squeezing the child's hand. "And we made a difference." The soldier moved toward the exit with the officials, his posture calm, but his presence commanding respect. The father watched quietly, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. He had acted with no expectation of reward, yet he could see clearly that his action had been meaningful. Airline staff approached the father and child again, more formally this time. "Sir," one of them said, "we'd like to acknowledge your gesture. The company intends to review policies based on situations like this, ensuring passengers acting with integrity are recognized and supported." The father shook his head slightly. "I don't need recognition," he said softly. "I just did what felt right." The child leaned against him. "But, Dad, they're noticing. That means it matters." He smiled gently, ruffling the child's hair. "Yes," he said, "it matters. And that's enough." Passengers continued to disembark, most unaware of the quiet events unfolding behind the scenes. The father and child walked slowly, hand in hand, reflecting on the journey. Every step felt different now, lighter, somehow. There was a quiet warmth in knowing that a simple act could resonate far beyond the moment it was done. Outside, the night was calm. Lights on the runway reflected softly on the tarmac, and vehicles moved efficiently, carrying luggage and passengers. The father paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He looked at his child, who mirrored his expression, small eyes filled with curiosity and understanding. "Remember this, okay?" the father said softly. "Kindness, courage, and helping others quietly, those things matter. Even if we don't see the impact right away, it matters." The child nodded, gripping his father's hand tighter. "I won't forget," the child whispered. The soldier, now a few steps ahead with the officials, turned back briefly and offered one last small nod toward the father. Gratitude, respect, and acknowledgement flowed through that simple gesture, unspoken but deeply felt. The father smiled faintly, feeling a warmth he had not expected. The weight of the day, the stress, the fatigue, all of it seemed lighter now. He had done something good, quietly and sincerely, and it had mattered. They moved toward the terminal doors. Outside, the world continued. Passengers rushing, vehicles moving, announcements echoing. But inside the father and child, a quiet sense of peace had settled. "Dad," the child said softly, "will we see him again?" "Maybe," the father replied. "But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we help when we could. That's what counts." They walked together, leaving the plane and entering the terminal, feeling a sense of dignity and connection that no words could fully capture. The father realized that in life, small acts of kindness often create ripples far larger than we can imagine. They don't need applause or recognition. They simply need courage and the will to act. The soldier disappeared into the night with the officials, but the memory of the interaction lingered. It would not fade. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary circumstances, a crowded flight, a delayed gate, a busy airport, human connection, compassion, and courage could transform moments into something extraordinary. The father held the child's hand tightly, looking down at the small face filled with curiosity and wonder. "This is one of those moments," he whispered, "something that will stay with us forever." The child nodded, smiling faintly. "I'm glad we helped him, Dad." "So am I," the father replied, his heart swelling with quiet pride. "And that's what matters most." They continued walking to the terminal, side by side, leaving the plane behind but carrying the lesson forward. Small acts of kindness, done without expectation, have the power to change lives, shift perspectives, and remind us of the humanity that connects us all. And as they stepped into the night, the father knew that while the soldier's journey would continue, the memory of that quiet act of courage and compassion would remain with him and his child forever. A quiet, lasting reminder that the right choice, no matter how small, can create ripples far beyond what we can see. Sometimes, the simplest gestures are the ones that make the biggest difference. And in that moment, the father knew they had done exactly what needed to be done.